World War II. Selective Service Act of 1917. Before we discuss World War II, we must take a look at a few events that occurred before the war began, for only then will we understand the war itself. Let's go back to 1917, to the Selective Service Act that was drafted after the U.S. entered the First World War. This act authorized President Woodrow Wilson to raise a volunteer infantry force of not more than 4 divisions. All males between the ages of 21 and 30 were required to register for military service. A year after this act was passed, over 23 million men had registered. Around 4 million men were ultimately drafted into the armed forces. Half of these men served overseas during the war. The Kellogg-Briand Pact. Now let's look at the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It was signed by Germany, France, and the United States on August 27, 1928. It was an international agreement in which states promised not to use war to solve their foreign problems. In case you're wondering, this was named after its authors, Frank B. Kellogg and the French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand. Now let's look at the Neutrality Act. These laws were passed by the United States Congress in the 1930s in response to the growing turmoil in Europe and Asia that eventually led to World War II. These laws were spurred by the growth in isolationism and non-interventionism in the U.S. following its costly involvement in World War I and sought to ensure that the U.S. would not become entangled again in foreign conflicts. The U.S. did not want to engage in another world war after World War I had ended. Quarantine Speech. The Quarantine Speech was a well-known speech given by President Franklin Roosevelt on October 5, 1937, in Chicago, calling for an international quarantine of the aggressor nations. This speech intensified America's isolationist mood, causing protests by isolationists and foes to intervention. No countries were directly mentioned in the speech, but everyone assumed Roosevelt referred to Japan, Italy, and Germany. He suggested the use of economic pressure, which was a forceful response but less direct than outright aggression. Totalitarian government. Let's take a look at totalitarian governments. This type of government allows no one to have freedom. It includes a strong central rule that attempts to control and direct all aspects of individual life through coercion and repression. By the beginning of World War II, totalitarian had become synonymous with absolutism and oppressive single-party governments. Which countries had a totalitarian government? Totalitarian governments. The totalitarian states of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin were the first examples of totalitarianism, in which the state achieved overwhelmingly popular support for its leadership. Appeasement. It's important now to understand appeasement. This was the British and French policy of conceding to Adolf Hitler's territorial demands prior to the outbreak of World War II. Associated primarily with British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the appeasement policy enabled Hitler to systematically take over the territories of several neighboring countries. The Munich Pact, an example of appeasement, was a September 30th, 1938 agreement among Germany, Britain, Italy, and France that allowed Germany to annex the region of western Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Non-Aggression Pact. Several months after Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland on August 23, 1939, in Moscow, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Minister Vyacheslav Molotov met and then announced that Germany and the USSR had signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact to prevent hostilities between the two countries. However, they kept secret the fact that, in addition to agreeing not to attack each other, Germany and the USSR had also agreed to overrun the countries that lay between them. Specifically, they agreed that Germany and the USSR would each take over one half of Poland, with a further provision that the USSR would take over Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia without German interference. So, how did World War II begin? In Europe, in September 1939, Germany, under Chancellor Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany, but took little action over the following months, which only allowed Hitler to do as he pleased. In 1940, Germany attacked and quickly conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Who were part of the Axis? During World War II, the nations involved were divided into two separate groups, the Axis and the Allies. Who were part of the Axis? The big three in the Axis were Germany, led by Hitler, Italy, led by Mussolini, and Japan, led by Emperor Hirohito. Also in the Axis were Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Who were the Allies? Fighting against the Axis were the Allies. The big four were the United States, United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, or USSR, or Russia, and France. The other allies were Australia, Belgium, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, China, Denmark, Greece, Mexico, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia. The battle in Europe continues. So back to the war. What happened after Germany invaded all those countries in 1940? Later that summer, Germany launched a further attack on Britain, this time from the air. The Battle of Britain was Germany's first military failure. From July 1940 to the spring of 1941, British air forces fought off wave after wave of German bombers and denied Germany in its quest to attain air superiority over Britain. Although major cities in England sustained heavy damage, the British resistance forced Germany to abandon its plans to invade across the English Channel. It was a victory for the Allies. Greece and North Africa. Italy, an ally of Hitler's Germany and led by Benito Mussolini, expanded the war further by invading Greece and North Africa. They failed, and Germany was forced to come to Italy's assistance in early 1941. Italy's leader, Mussolini, had established a repressive fascist regime that valued nationalism, militarism, anti-liberalism, and anti-communism, combined with strict censorship and state propaganda. A quick side note, Mussolini. He was a fascist prime minister who came to power in 1922 and ruled Italy as an absolute dictator. He was an inspiration to Adolf Hitler, with whom he chose to ally himself. Looking ahead a couple of years, just for your personal knowledge, in 1943 he was overthrown by some of his subordinates, and in 1945 was executed by Italian partisans just prior to the end of World War II in Europe. The USSR. Okay, back to the war. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, USSR. At first, Germany made swift progress and advanced deep into the Russian heartland, but the country was just too big, and eventually Russia's strength, determination, and brutal winters was more than the German army could overcome. Hitler used the Blitzkrieg, which meant lightning war, as an invasion strategy of attacking a nation subtly and overwhelmingly with force. This is how Germany invaded Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Lend-Lease and the Atlantic Charter. The Lend-Lease Act was passed in March of 1941. It empowered Roosevelt to give aid to the Allies in exchange for whatever kind of compensation or benefit the president deemed acceptable. August 9th through 13th of 1941, President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met to create the Atlantic Charter. They met on the Atlantic Ocean to define the Allied goals for the post-war world. Their ideal goals were for no territorial aggrandizement, no territorial changes made against the wishes of the people, restoration of self-government to those deprived of it, free access to raw materials, reduction of trade restrictions, global cooperation to secure better economic and social conditions for all, freedom from fear and want, freedom of the seas, and abandonment of the use of force, as well as disarmament of aggressor nations. The Pacific Theater, Pearl Harbor. The War in the Pacific began on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise air attack on the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japan had already been at war with China for several years and had seized the Chinese territory of Manchuria. After the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan began a massive campaign of expansion throughout the Southeast Asia Pacific region. Island hopping. Let's take a moment to define island hopping. This was a military strategy employed by the Allies in the Pacific War against Japan and the Axis powers. The idea was to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and instead concentrate the limited Allied resources on strategically important islands that were not well defended, but capable of supporting the drive to the main island of Japan. The Women's Army Corps, WAC. So let's look at the Women's Army Corps. This was the women's branch of the United States Army, created as an auxiliary unit on May 15, 1942, and converted to full status in 1943. About 150,000 American women served during World War II. They were the first women other than nurses to serve with the Army. This is important for many reasons. Some of these ladies served in the U.S., while some traveled overseas. It's also important to note that many men opposed the WAC. They felt women should not be fulfilling these particular roles. Rosie the Riveter. Here's a picture of Rosie the Riveter. She was a cultural icon of the United States, representing American women who worked in factories during World War II, many of whom produced munitions and war supplies and sometimes took entirely new jobs, replacing the male workers who were in the military. Rosie the Riveter was commonly used as a symbol of feminism and women's economic power. The Tuskegee Airmen. Have you heard of the Tuskegee Airmen? This important group was comprised of African-American pilots who fought in the war for the U.S. Army Air Corps. They were the first African-American military aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces. During World War II, African-Americans in many U.S. states were still subject to the Jim Crow laws. The American military was racially segregated, as was much of the federal government. Tuskegee Airmen were subjected to racial discrimination, both within and outside the Army, yet they trained and flew with distinction. All black military pilots who trained in the U.S. trained at Tuskegee, including 5 Haitians. The Code Talkers. The Code Talkers were very important individuals during the war. These were Navajo Indians who used their then unwritten native language to transmit codes regarding every assault the Marines conducted in the Pacific. Thousands of their messages documented Japanese troop movements, battlefield tactics, and other communications critical to the war's outcome. The War Production Board and rationing. The War Production Board was established as a government agency on January 16, 1942 by an executive order of President Roosevelt. The purpose was to regulate the production of materials and fuel during World War II in the U.S. It altered and enlarged peacetime industries to meet war needs, allocated scarce materials important for war production, established priorities in the distribution of materials and services, and forbade non-essential production. It rationed such things as gasoline, heating oil, metals, rubber, paper, and plastics. And while we are on the subject of rationing, let's mention a few other items that were rationed during World War II. Sugar, processed foods, meat, fats, cheese, cars, stoves, typewriters, and more. If you're interested, you can find a great deal of information on the internet about these items and how people managed to live without them or with a small amount of certain goods during the year or during the war. Income taxes. Certainly everyone in the U.S. knows about the income tax. During World War II, politicians began implementing plans for withholding by creating a massive campaign that was aimed at Americans' patriotism, their sense of duty to their country, and their hatred towards the Axis powers. Politicians stressed the cost of the war. Our soldiers overseas need our money for guns, ammo, and equipment as quickly as possible. The government also released or approved propaganda posters and cartoon shorts that usually were played before the main feature at a movie theater. As a result, Americans felt good about paying income taxes. Propaganda. Propaganda was used to increase support for the war and commitment to an Allied victory. There was a wide variety of media that propagandists used to create hatred for the enemy and support for America's allies, urged greater public effort for war production, and victory gardens persuaded people to make do with what they had so that more materials could be used for the war effort and also to sell war bonds. Victory gardens. What were victory gardens? Also called war gardens or food gardens for defense, they were vegetable, fruit, and herb gardens planted at private residences and public parks in the U.S., United Kingdom, Canada, and even Germany during World War II to reduce the pressure on the public food supply brought on by the war effort. They were also considered a civil morale booster. Gardeners could feel empowered by their contribution and rewarded by the produce grown. They became part of daily life on the home front. The Pacific Theater. So, we took a look at a few important groups and terms. Now let's go back to the Pacific Theater, more specifically the U.S. and the Battle of Midway. The day after the Pearl Harbor attack, the U.S. declared war on Japan, but it would be several months before U.S. forces would get seriously involved militarily. In the late spring of 1942, the United States and Japan engaged in naval battles, ending with the Battle of Midway on June 3rd through 6, 1942, in which Japan suffered a catastrophic defeat. The Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was a 5-month battle between German and Soviet forces for the important industrial city of Stalingrad that resulted in the deaths of almost 2 million people. The battle involved very destructive air raids by the German Luftwaffe and bloody urban street fighting. In February 1943, despite direct orders from Hitler forbidding it, Field Marshal Frederick Paulus surrendered the German forces to the Red Army, and the German force fully retreated. The USSR and Operation Overlord. In 1944, the Germans were slowly forced out of Soviet territory, after which the Russians pursued them across Eastern Europe and into Germany itself in 1945. Operation Overlord was the code name for the Allied invasion of France in 1944, which commenced on the beaches of Normandy and ultimately was successful in liberating France and pushing German forces back east to their own territory. The Battle of the Bulge. This was the Battle of the Bulge. By December 24, 1944, the Germans had penetrated deep into French territory in the Ardennes forest, making a distinct bulge in the U.S. front line that gave the Battle of the Bulge its name. German forces surrounded many U.S. forces in the town of Bastogne, but they refused to surrender. The Germans were pushed back. Supplies were airdropped to the trapped American troops, and Allied armies came from other areas of France to help. By early January 1945, the Germans were again in retreat, and on January 16th, the Allied soldiers trapped at Bastogne were free, and the Bulge was no more. The D-Day invasion. What do people mean when they refer to the D-Day invasion? This was June 4th, 1944 invasion, when British and American forces landed in German-occupied France via the coast of Normandy. Soon, the German army was forced into retreat from that side as well, and by early 1945, Allied forces were beginning to close in on Germany from both the east and the west. The Soviets were the first to reach the German capital of Berlin, and Germany surrendered in May of 1945, shortly after the suicide of Adolf Hitler. The Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference occurred on February 4th, 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at Yalta, a resort on the Crimean Peninsula in the USSR. The Big Three, as they came to be called, discussed their strategy for the last stages of the war. They agreed that Britain and the U.S. would provide bomber support for Soviet troops fighting along the Eastern Front. Roosevelt and Churchill convinced Stalin to hold democratic elections in Poland, but these turned out to be heavily rigged in favor of a pro-Soviet communist government. The Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the code name for the U.S. government's secret program to develop an atomic bomb. Begun in 1942, the project utilized the expertise of world-famous physicists, including Albert Einstein and Enrique Fermi, to develop the weapon. The first successful atomic bomb test was conducted in July of 1945 at Alamogordo, New Mexico. The Pacific Theater and the approach to Japan. Back to the Pacific. Fighting continued in the Pacific in 1944 and early 1945, including a major battle at Iwo Jima. By late spring 1945, most of Japan's conquests had been freed, and Allied forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands. Allies began heavy bombing campaigns against major Japanese cities, including Tokyo. Finally, in early August 1945, President Harry Truman made a difficult decision for the U.S. to drop 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was the only use of nuclear weapons in war to date. Japan surrendered a few days later. 2 important days. There are 2 important days to remember. VE Day, Victory in Europe, occurred on May 8, 1945, when the Allied forces declared victory over Europe. VJ Day occurred on August 15, 1945, when the Allied forces declared victory over Japan. The Potsdam Conference. The Potsdam Conference was held in Potsdam, occupied Germany, from July 17 to August 2, 1945. The participants were Stalin for the Soviet Union, Churchill and later Clement Attlee for the United Kingdom, and President Harry Truman for the United States following the death of Franklin Roosevelt April 12, 45. They gathered to decide how to administer punishment to the defeated Nazi Germans, which had agreed to unconditional surrender 9 weeks earlier on May the 8th. The goals also included the establishment of post-war order, peace treaty issues, and countering the effects of war. A quick and close look at President Franklin Roosevelt. Everyone, let's take a quick and close look at the two U.S. presidents who saw us through World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the 32nd president and led the country through most of World War II until his death on April 12, 1945, just a few months before the war completely ended. With Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, Roosevelt helped hold together the Allied coalition that ultimately defeated Nazi Germany. President Harry Truman. The second president that saw us through World War II was Harry Truman, our 33rd president, who succeeded Roosevelt in April 1945. He led the country through the last months of the war and is best known for making the controversial decision to use 2 atomic bombs against Japan in August 1945. After the war, Truman was crucial in the implementation of the Marshall Plan, which greatly accelerated Western Europe's economic recovery. The GI Bill. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known informally as the GI Bill, was a law that provided a range of benefits for returning World War II veterans, GIs. Benefits included low-cost mortgages, loans to start a business or farm, cash payments of tuition and living expenses to attend college, high school or vocational education, and 1 year of unemployment compensation. This was available to every veteran who had been on active duty during the war years for at least 90 days and had not been dishonorably discharged. Combat was not required. So what was the Marshall Plan? Officially called the European Recovery Program, or ERP, it was the primary plan of the United States for rebuilding and creating a stronger foundation for the countries of Western Europe and repelling communism after World War II. This plan was named for Secretary of State George Marshall and was largely the creation of State Department officials. It began in April of 1948 and was in operation for 4 years. During that period, some $13 billion in economic and technical assistance were given to help the recovery of the European countries. Now let's take a closer look at Adolf Hitler. He was born on April 20th, 1887 in Austria. He always dreamed of being an artist, but failed twice to secure entry to the Academy of Fine Arts. He enlisted in the German army and saw 4 years of frontline service, during which he was wounded several times, decorated for bravery twice. Hitler served as an intelligence agent for the military authorities. He attended a meeting of the tiny German Workers' Party in 1919. He later joined the party, became its leader, and changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, later called the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler continued. In 1920, the 25 points of the Nazi Party were proclaimed. They called for the removal of the Jews from German society. Nazis tried to seize power by force in November 1923, called the Beer Hall Putsch, but they were thwarted by the Munich police. Hitler was convicted of high treason and sentenced to prison, where he served about a year. In prison, he began to write Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which later became the second Bible in Nazi Germany. Eventually, he was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President von Hindenburg, January 30th, 1933. More Adolf Hitler. Over the next 6 years, Hitler worked to rid Germany of its obligations under the Treaty of Versailles, which was imposed on Germany after World War I. Hitler worked to restore the economy, which had been devastated by the Great Depression, to rearm the country, and acquire Lebensraum, living space, for Germany. In Mein Kampf, he had written of the need for this living space, which he said could only be acquired at the expense of the countries to the east, notably Russia. In 1938, by a series of intrigues, Germany annexed Austria and the Sudeten portion of Czechoslovakia, and in 1939 occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia. More Hitler. Hitler implemented ways to remove Jews from German life, including gradual exclusion from most spheres of professional activity, rules as to where they could live, prohibition of marriage and other relations between Germans and Jews, economic sanctions, and many others. Jews were harassed, attacked, beaten, and persecuted. Many were imprisoned in concentration camps under protective custody orders, which were the same as indefinite imprisonment. In these camps, they were beaten, abused, starved, and murdered. The concentration camps. These concentration camps increased rapidly in number. By the late 1930s, there were hundreds of camps scattered throughout Germany. The conservative estimate that those who were murdered in the Nazi death camp stands at about 3.5 million. Most were European Jews who were killed for no other reason than the fact that they were Jewish. Nazis rationalized this with their belief that they were superior. Finally, Joseph Stalin. We've talked a great deal about Joseph Stalin, but who was he? He was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1953. He purged the party of enemies of the people, resulting in the execution of thousands and the exile of millions to the Gulag system of slave labor camps, the Great Terror of the 1930s. Stalin was ill-prepared for Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union in June of 1941, but recovered to lead his country to victory. He was somewhat responsible for the USSR's severe losses at the beginning of the war because he ignored the warnings of his advisors and did not allow the Russian military to prepare a proper defense. However, he did succeed in holding the country together and inspiring his people to resist against Germany, which ultimately forced a German retreat. Many people don't realize this, but Stalin's own regime in the USSR was just as brutal as the Nazi regime in many ways, and the alliance between Stalin and the Western Allies always remained rather tenuous because of mutual distrust.